Great. Good morning, everyone. So this is the GTD on open source policy. So a lot of this is expressed in an RFD that I admittedly just published, RFD 164. So I'm going to go kind of somewhat through the RFD and it explains some of basically what we're doing here is talking about edge conditions. So let me talk about our open source principles more broadly, and then we'll get into some of these edge conditions and then deal with any questions that folks might have. So first of all, thanks to Angela for suggesting the need for this, because open source is something that we've been doing now for so long that I think I've kind of forgotten some of the need to clarify this. But for folks that are coming new to the organization, and even folks that are within the organization, the reality is that even though we are an open source company, that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of questions at the boundaries. So the purpose of this is to kind of elucidate or answer some of those questions. Folks probably know this, should know this, everyone knows this. We are an open source company in that open source is very important to everything that we do. We are built upon open source, first and foremost. Joyent, from the beginning, from its founding in 2004, was built on open source system software. And if Joyent had tried to exist 10 years prior in a proprietary software era, it could not have been built, just as Google could not have been built and Facebook could not have been built. It could not have been built at the same level of economics. So Joyent very much depended on open source from the very, very, very beginning. Initially with FreeBSD and in jails, and then when Solaris was open sourced, Open Solaris in whatever that was, 2000 and whenever it was, 2005, right? God, it's been a long time. Joyent jumped and adopted Open Solaris, and in general, continued to adopt open source projects. When Node.js, when James Duncan, who was at Joyent at the time, and co discovered Node.js, they really lunged at it and employed Brian Dahl. We became the company behind Node.js, which meant we were contributing to two very large open source projects that we were using, SmartOS, an Illumos derivative, and Node.js. For a while, that was kind of the state of affairs. A lot of the things we were creating were open source. A bunch of things that we had created were not open source. Certainly the software that we'd been using for SDC was historically not open source, but some of the components were open source. Some of the components were open source, but sitting in kind of personal GitHub repos. Some of them were, so it was a little bit of a mess. In 2014, now, I mean, 4+ years ago, we open sourced everything. So we did a huge effort. Robert was reminding me yesterday of the OSS tools repo that we had, and going through every repository that we had, scrubbing history, and getting that all out there and open. A lot of people did a lot of great work to get it open, because it is a lot of work to open source software. We kind of, or I think people who haven't done this don't realize how difficult it is when software grows up proprietary, even in a company that is very open source friendly, as we always have been. Opening that up can be a lot of work. So we did all that in 2014, and the good news is, ever since then, we've basically been an open source first company, is the way I would say it. I mean, we've had bits that are not open source, but our strong disposition our strong bias on any software that we write is to be open source. When Samsung was contemplating acquiring Joyent, one of the first questions that the group leading the acquisition asked us being Scott Hammond, Bill Fine, and me, and Angela, right? Because Angela was there as well. What were our top priorities for the company? And what was interesting to me is that my top priority was that everything would remain open source, because I felt that if things were made proprietary, there were lots of other things that we would lose control of. What was interesting to me is that everyone else's top priority was also that we remain open source. Scott's top priority was that we remain open source. Scott really championed this effort as CEO of Joyent at the time. So that was a big deal for us going into the Samsung acquisition, is that we would remain open source. And we've done that. I mean, I think that we have been able to be true to that. Samsung's been very supportive of our open source efforts. And I think that that's actually been very important for us, is that we have remained an open source company. And that's important for lots of reasons, right? Lots of us just feel, I'm speaking personally, I don't want to really work on proprietary software again, because all of us are playing the long game here with respect to our careers. We don't want to solve the same problem 5 times over in our careers, or even twice over in our careers. Like when I solve a problem, I want to have the luxury of being able to use that solution in future lives. So that is selfishly why I believe in open source, but obviously there are lots and lots of reasons why we believe in open source, as a consumer of it, as a contributor to it, and actually originating it. So one thing that I did want to do somewhat formally in this RFD is introduce a focal point for decisions around open source, which I think, I mean, there haven't had to be a huge number of these, but I think over the years, I think has basically been me, informally, where I've worked with folks on specific issues. I wanted to create that role formally, so I created what I would call the Open Source Council Office, or OSCO. The idea with OSCO is that it doesn't need to be the CTO. It could be another group of people. It could be another person or group of people. But you need some person or group of people who can serve as a clearinghouse for ambiguity, for questions around just resolving issues. They're often very small, and they really just need someone who can kind of definitively act on behalf of the company. And the role of the OSCO should be, in my view, should be balancing our principles around open source, namely that we believe in open source, that we are an open source company, we believe in contributing to open source, we believe in open sourcing our own software with risk to the company. And those principles should take precedent. So if we need to decide between the principles and the risk, because clearly it would minimize risk to become proprietary for everything. Like that is the way to minimize risk. Risk is zero when everything is proprietary. So but that's not what we're seeking to do. We're seeking to adhere to these principles while minimizing risk. So the goal is to minimize risk, not eliminate it. But the OSCO can serve as kind of the arbiter for questions or to resolve ambiguity. So in terms of, just because any open source discussion is going to end in licensing, so might as well start there. In terms of licensing, licensing obviously affects every aspect of open source. It affects not just the open source that we create. It also affects the open source that we use. So we do have guidelines in terms of the licenses that we're going to use. Fortunately, this is a non-issue in most cases, because most of the software that we want to use is under a license that we have no problem using without restraint. So that may be the MPL, any variant of the MPL, Mozilla Public License, the MIT license, the BSD license. The BSD license has, the BSD license has a kind of a long history. There is an old BSD license called the 4-clause BSD license that has an advertising clause. You basically don't find that anymore. That's basically been eliminated. But so the 3-clause, 2-clause, and what are called 0-clause variants. I think there might be a 1-clause as well that I need to probably add to that doc. That accounts for a lot of our software. The Apache license, which is very similar to the MPL, and there's a 1.0, 1.1, and 2.0 variant of that. That's all good. And then the CDL, the Common Development Distribution License. These licenses are all pretty similar in spirit. They are all permissive licenses. The MPL is a file-based copyleft. MPL and APL both may deal with patent licensing, and CUDL is also a file-based copyleft, deal with patent issues. Part of the problem with MIT and BSD is they're a little too lean in that they don't deal with things like patents. We kind of prefer these other licenses, but have no problem using MIT or BSD. There are a bunch of other licenses that are effectively derivatives of one of those licenses. There was an era of total license proliferation. For example, Postgres is under its own license, which obviously makes no sense. And if you look at the Postgres license, it is essentially an MIT-ish license or a BSD-ish license, but not exactly. I've tried to outline a bunch of those here with the PostgreSQL license, the Python license, the public domain, obviously. There's the artistic license, it's Perl. Of course, it's going to be different. There's the zlib license, the PHP license, the ICU license. I'd like this list to be probably a complete list of the licenses that we're already using that are all basically equivalent to one another. Some of these licenses are unfortunate in that they are not very helpful. I mean, there's the do whatever the fuck you want license, which is an actual license, which we actually have software under the do whatever the fuck you want license. As you can imagine, it is a left pad like module that is being used by a dependency of a dependency of a dependency of a dependency. It's kind of a dumbass license. I don't want to enshrine it in this doc, but it's not a very good license in that it is a little too terse, but fine. So those are the licenses that we can use without hesitation. And again, I'm sure there are things in that list that I'm missing. There are a couple of other licenses that are fine for internal use, but we should be cautious about adding them to the software. And this includes licenses that are the GPL. So the GPL and the V2 or V3 and the LGPL. And yes, those licenses are really popular in part because, or solely because of Linux, which is obviously under the GPL v2. But actually less and less software is under the GPL, and more software is under MIT and BSD, because the GPL has a lot of ambiguity to it. GPL v2 hasn't really been completely litigated, and it, in particular with the GPL v2, there are a bunch of open questions with it with respect to the GPL v2 and derived work. And it's still an open question whether one can combine CUDL work, for example, and GPL v2 work and not violate the GPL. You're not violating the CUDL by doing that, but are you violating the GPL? And the answer is, well, probably not, but no one really knows. Canonical just decided actually a couple years ago that they analyzed the legal risk of this and just decided, screw it, we're going to start shipping ZFS with our distro because we believe that this is not violating the GPL. I personally believe that it doesn't matter because, in that particular case, because it's not litigatable, because you're going to be very hard pressed to show damages one way or the other. So I just don't think it as a practical matter. I mean, ultimately, litigation is an economic activity, and litigation of that nature is just not going to make any economic sense whatsoever. But the GPL v2 does have a lot of ambiguity, and we want to avoid it if we possibly can. So where we've got software that is actually GPL v2, and we've got an alternative that's not GPL v2, we're going to want to prefer something that's not GPL v2 or GPL v3 or LGPL. And certainly any software that we create should not be under any of these licenses, just because they are so ambiguous. But it doesn't mean we can't integrate them in the product. It means we just need to do that. The OSCO should be involved where we integrate them in the product. Actually, when we did a big Black Duck license audit as part of the due diligence for the Samsung acquisition, which I think Angela and Trent and others can't help but kind of smirking to themselves with the kind of some of the silliness of that license audit, but it was actually helpful. We went through all NPM modules. Trent, I think you did that work of actually just going through all the NPM modules and doing the license audit. And amazingly, there was no GPL in there. Because you would think that one of these knuckleheaded dependencies would be GPL v2 and would have kind of polluted everything, but that really didn't happen, which is great. So we actually don't have a lot of GPL software right now. And we don't want to create any more of it because of the ambiguity, but it's possible at least to deal with, possible to do with the AGPL. Then there's another class of licenses which are which we can only use for things that we use, not things that we ever integrate into the software. This includes things, I mean, the AGPL is kind of the classic one of these. So the Affero GPL expands the definition of a derived work to say that if you build a service on top of this, a network-facing service, then all the source code for that needs to be made available under the same license. There is no definition of what a network-facing service constitutes, and the AGPL would have a really hard time, I think, holding up in court. It would really have to extend the idea of what a derived work is. The AGPL makes any company extremely nervous because the last thing you want is to have something in the product that then forces other software to be have to be released under that same license. We don't want to have to force our software to be AGPL, and we certainly wouldn't want to do that because we have erroneously used AGPL software in our own software. So the AGPL is, you know, just as these things happen, the AGPL, which at one point looked radical, now looks moderate because a whole slew of companies who are quote unquote open source companies who have now decided that they are that the other cloud computing companies, read Amazon, are somehow being mean to them by using their software without actually contributing anything back, have introduced much more restrictive licenses. So this includes the server-side public license, the SSPL. It includes then there would be actually much worse licenses, the Confluent Community License, the Redis Source Available License. These are not actually open source licenses. I think what these companies are doing is pretty shady in that they are putting riders on their software that actually prevents that software from being used in certain ways. That's not open source. The whole idea of open source is that you can use the software however you like. We're not going to restrict your use. And the reason that's important is because it's an extremely slippery slope to start saying that you know, this software can be used by people I like, but not by people I don't like. And I believe, you know, and folks probably saw my blog entry on this, but I believe that these licenses are not going to hold up in court, wouldn't hold up in court. But it doesn't matter. We're not going to be the ones to litigate that. We're not going to use the software. So for some software, you know, the AGPL, we can use and have used the AGPL stuff internally. There is software that was AGPL that we can use internally, but for our own internal use. But we won't integrate that software into the product without it being under a different license. Now, a lot of these companies, by the way, have the business model that if you want to use their product, you've got to go approach them for a license where they'll give you a different license to the product that's not AGPL, but we're not going to participate in that. Folks have asked about Redis in particular because the Redis Source Available license is one of the ones that's verboten. But it's like, hey, aren't we using Redis in lots of places? Yes, but we're not using the Redis modules that are covered under the Redis Source Available license. We are using Redis itself, which is, I believe, it's either BSD or MIT, but it is not under the Source Available license, which, to Redis's credit, they have at least renamed to something that doesn't imply that it's open source. It's source available, not open source, and that's an important difference. Also, any license bearing the Commons Clause addendum is going to be on the verboten list. Commons Clause is another one of these attempts to do something that appears to be open source, but it's actually not open source, and they've been adding it as a rider on Apache, which makes it really kind of pernicious. And the Commons Clause, again, restricts your use, so we're not going to do anything that does that. So those are the licenses in the verboten category. Again, we can use that software for our own internal use, but it must never touch what becomes the product or the software that we use as part of the service. So that is the use of open source. Any questions on that? I'm not sure any questions on additional licensing, various demerits going on in chat there. So let's talk now about contribution, because we do believe, and these companies, Redis and Confluent and so on, are basically accusing Amazon of malfeasance because it's not contributing back software. And that I think, on the one hand, I think that's too far. I don't think it is. It is not. Amazon is not behaving poorly necessarily. They're just not behaving well, and they're violating. There is, we believe, there's a social contract to open source, which is, hey, if you're using this thing and it's important to you, and you found an issue that you have fixed in it, please let others benefit from that. Let others benefit from the same kind of benefit that you had. And companies have been very slow to wake up to that social contract. Companies like Google were honestly violating that social contract for a long time, for a decade or more, before they began to really begin to contribute to open source in earnest. I think that you got to give companies time on this. I think even Amazon is actually getting better about, which I never thought they would, but Amazon's getting better about contributing back to open source. But it is a social contract, and that's the way we've got to interpret it. This is not companies behaving poorly. It's companies that are not necessarily behaving well. We want to be a company that behaves well. We want to adhere to that social contract, and honestly, that social contract is somewhat in our own self-interest, in that we don't want to float patches on things. It's painful to float patches on source. We want to integrate things into upstream because we want to actually change the direction of some of these things, or affect the direction of these things. We also don't want to be floating our own patches. So it's an enlightened self-interest, but I would say the social contract of this is as important as anything. When we are contributing things upstream, just a couple of guidelines or things where we honestly have hit divots. One that I would love to say that we don't need to call out, but experience has taught us otherwise, is around personal attribution. So just because we are an open source company does not mean that you can grab the diff of something that a peer of yours has developed and float that yourself upstream. Yes, it has happened, and it is unfortunate. It's deeply unfortunate because that really erodes the trust that we have. You're violating the trust of your coworker, especially when that thing is being floated upstream without knowledge of that coworker, or you're passing that work off as your own. That's really inappropriate, and that's again, that's violating our collective trust. So it's really important, and again, I think for the vast majority of people, they don't need to hear this, but just to have it reinforced, we really want to make sure we're recognizing the work of our peers. A big part of open source, the reason we do open source, is to allow individual expression behind the corporate veil. So you can see, one of the things that I really liked is that, when one of our engineers, when Jordan Hendricks had come to Joyent and she did her first project, she was able to tweet out the link to it, and her peers could see, hey, this is the work I did, and I'm proud of it, and I'm proud of the craft that I showed on this, and you can see what it is. That's important, and it's important that we recognize that, and that work is attributed appropriately. That's generally going to be in the author field of the Git commit. Git allows the commit field and the author field are separate, which actually is a great thing about Git, because it means that you can do work and then I can upstream it on your behalf, and both of us effectively get credit for that. I get credit for committing it, which is there's work associated with that. You get credited with originally doing the work. And if you want to actually see that, I'm sure there's an easier way to do this with Git, but if you want to see that in the log, that's a git log -- pretty equals Fuller, a syntax that trolls me every time for just its absolute massacre of the English language. But that will show you your the author versus the commit field, and that author field should reflect that original work. Everything we do, the copyright is held by Joyent, and this has been an area of kind of ambiguity in the past. You personally do not hold copyright on the work you do for Joyent. You actually don't hold, and I know this sounds fascist, but you also don't hold copyright on the work you do, even on quote unquote your own time in California. You don't actually, Joyent actually holds copyright to that. Now we're very accommodating of work that is truly being done. If you're writing a novel on your spare time, Joyent does not hold copyright to that. But for other open source work you're doing, Joyent by default does actually own copyright to that. And if you feel that that shouldn't be the case, you should connect with the OSCO and or HR, and we can make sure that your employment agreement is amended with work that you feel is your own work. When you came to work for Joyent, that agreement contains work that has separated out that is your own work. If you've got your own work, that should be in that employment agreement, and that is to protect you, as well as to protect Joyent. But in general, all the work that we do, copyright is held by Joyent, so it will be attributed to you personally, but the copyright is actually held by Joyent, and it is important that that copyright is made clear. The way that's done is going to totally vary based on project. The way we've done that for where we've got file-based copyleft, and the way that I personally like doing this, but I know that other people that other projects don't do it this way. I like having the copyright header in the file. So in a given file, here are the companies that have contributed to this file. That to me is helpful. I can understand that there are projects where this would lead to ridiculously large copyright blocks, but I think for file-based copyleft, in general, the file granularity tends to break this up enough that you don't see too much of that. I think the most I think we've got like one file with like 6 copyrights on it in Illumos. Admittedly, Illumos is much smaller than Linux, but I think that it would be viable. Anyway, that's the way we do it in Joyent projects. That is our preference, is to make sure that every file has that copyright header. Again, that's just to protect us. What is the purpose of that? The purpose of that copyright header is just to let anyone know that we are aware of our own rights. If you don't have that copyright notice, you still hold copyright. So if we were to have something out there that doesn't have Joyent's copyright, but is copyrighted by Joyent, Joyent would have copyright on it. As you can imagine, it would be difficult to defend that copyright if that became litigated. So that copyright is there to be able to defend that copyright and to make anyone aware, hey, we know our rights with respect to this. Now, you may have seen, and lawyers have vacillated many times over my career. It's like the lawyers themselves shows the ambiguity of the law. What should be in that copyright claim? The law says you need to have the word copyright or the little C with a circle around it, the year, and the entity. That is the way that you make people aware of your rights. And that if you are missing that, you don't necessarily not have copyright, but you can make things much more challenging to actually assert that copyright. This has changed again over the years. You may have seen all rights reserved. You don't need all rights reserved. All rights reserved, your rights are always reserved. You don't need to say that. You don't need to have the copyright and the little C and the year. So this has gotten kind of less ornate over the years. You really just need copyright year, in this case, copyright 2019, Joyent Inc. the end. When we want to add that with other blocks, when we want to, that there are other companies in there, we just kind of, cozy ours right up next to it. And even though their formats are going to vary, just say it should go without question, but do not change someone else's copyright. That's just a recipe for trouble. So leave everyone else's copyright alone. If you really wanted to invite a long and pointless discussion, go edit someone else's copyright. You'd be like, well, you don't need the C here, you don't need the year here, you don't need all rights reserved, so there, I fixed it for you. It's like, that's going to be a lot of conversations that you don't want to have. So I would also say that if you are contributing to a project that has got a different way of expressing that copyright, this is not a hill to die on. So it's important that in a project, we are able to ascertain easily the work that we hold copyright to. So what we won't allow is for Joyent not to be credited at all. So what we're not going to do, and we've had open source projects that want to take a diff with literally no other indicator that this is Joyent owned IP. We're not going to do that. We've got to have something else that indicates this is Joyent IP. If it's not going to be a block there, maybe it can be a contributors file. This is the way Node has done it. It's got a contributors file. If it's a contributors file which contains individual contributors, that's fine. We ask that you and generally ask that when you're doing work on behalf of Joyent, use your corporate email address, please. So use @joyent.com to clearly indicate that you were doing this as a Joyent employee. And we haven't always been great about that in the past. I'm sure you can find examples where I've accidentally committed stuff and kept the wrong email address. Those are mistakes. We want to be doing it from Joyent.com. Ashwin asks, what if the years aren't updated in front of the copyright? Again, that's something where what we always do, we always update the year with the last modification. And again, that is to preserve our own rights because copyright actually is finite. It is finite. The actual length is something that has been changed over the years, in part because there is a certain mouse owned by a certain entertainment company that they are terrified of falling out of copyright. So they've been lobbying their Southern California representatives to assure that copyright is extended in perpetuity.
This year was the first year things started entering.
This is the first year that things started entering. Well, things have been entering for a long time. This is the first year that Steamboat Willie loses copyright. And I think the Disney company has realized that they can survive. The public domaining of Steamboat Willie is a survivable event. You are now free to do whatever horrific things you want to go do to Steamboat Willie, and I'm sure people have. But copyright is finite. That's why the year is there. We do update the year with the last year. I would not. Actually, just to deal with it quickly, Jason talks about Happy Birthday is no longer under copyright. That's actually not because it expired. That's because it was never actually under copyright. Those rights were mistakenly asserted, and that was actually effectively always in the public domain. But Happy Birthday, if you are not aware of this, for many, many years, Happy Birthday was under copyright. And this is why if you're watching like a Friends episode, they wouldn't sing Happy Birthday on the Friends episode because they would have had to pay something to Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers just had to pay all that back. So anyway. We digress. Again, not a hill to die on. So if you've got an open source project that wants to do things a different way, you can work with the OSCO and kind of figure it out if it's acceptable. Basically, we are trying to find a way to not give up our copyrights and to make sure that our copyright is asserted, but in a way that is in accordance with the project. So there will be different ways of doing this. On source from third parties, this actually does come up where, especially we're dealing with a company that's got a driver for a particular piece of hardware, and that driver is open source, but it maybe is in another project. It's over here in BSD, or maybe it's in Linux, or maybe it's proprietary, firmly proprietary. Maybe they've done a port to us and we want to actually integrate that. We have done that. We will do that. We want to be able to do that. We are happy to perform that service. We did this for Beehive as well, for example, where we took source that other people had developed. We are absolutely happy to do that. You just want to engage the OSCO when you're doing that, but basically we want to make sure that we are not exposing ourselves to additional risk. We want to make sure that the source code was not merely found in a dumpster, or if it was found in a dumpster, that we are minimizing risk. Not necessarily, I'm not saying never on found in a dumpster, just let's be sure we're minimizing risk. There's something called, there is de minimis use in the law, although the actual, what constitutes de minimis is constantly up for reinterpretation. My view on de minimis work is pretty constrained. So I view that the pure deletion of code, and actually I could go either way on this. If you want to convince me otherwise, I'll take it. Because I've had changes that actually, bugs that took a long time to diagnose, where the fix was simply the pure removal of code. Now, I would say that like this is an important change actually, and I think I would assert copyright on the actual that removal of code. But I think we can consider pure deletion of code to be de minimis. Correcting spelling or grammar we can view to be de minimis. Changing only the code comments we can view to be de minimis, but not if you're changing it significantly. But any code change, however small, is not de minimis. So if you are changing the code, it's not de minimis. And in particular, you'll get some software engineers that want to play lawyer in other open source projects that will say like, well, we don't want, like, we've got your bug fix here, but we're not going to let you assert copyright on it because it's a one-liner. It's like, no, it's a one. It doesn't matter. It's a one-liner. It's a one-liner. It's a bug fix. You want it. It's not de minimis. Don't let anyone convince you that it is de minimis. But I'd be willing to concede on stuff that is sets fire grammar deletion code. So on conduct, one of the things that has made the world more complicated is as open source has proliferated, many more companies are engaged in open source. Many more people are engaged in open source, and people ruin everything, as we know, and you get bad conduct. We expect people to act professionally when we are engaging with them in a professional context. If you are engaging in an open source community as part of your job, it is my expectation, it is our expectation that people will engage with you in a professional manner. And if they don't engage with you in a professional manner, we need to take action. This can obviously be complicated. There is tons of ambiguity, but what we don't want to have is a situation where we have an employee, to take it to kind of to an extreme. You do not want to have an employee being harassed by someone in an open source community. That, as far as I'm concerned, is workplace harassment, even though I'm sure a lawyer just had a major twitch when I said that. That is workplace harassment. And this is honestly the reason that Torvalds was ultimately brought to task, is because companies like IBM had plenty of employees who were refusing to engage with Linux because of the way they were being berated, or the kind of the berating that was happening by Torvalds. We are not going to tolerate that. If that happens, you should escalate to either the OSCO or Joyent HR per your comfort level. So if you feel comfortable escalating to the OSCO, do that. If you don't, Joyent HR, please. And Joyent HR will handle dealing with this issue. There's again a ton of ambiguity here. There is nothing that's going to be pat or simple. And we have had and will have these issues. Honestly, bluntly, we've got issues where we have got ex-employees who were terminated for cause who are in open source communities that we need to deal with. It's like, and speaking personally, I don't feel comfortable engaging with those folks one-on-one. And I don't think, I think everyone else probably wouldn't either. And so these issues do absolutely come up. I would like to believe that they're the exception, not the rule, but just to give you the specific vectors for dealing with those issues. In terms of contributor license agreements, we don't believe in CLAs in general. CLAs are a way of basically warranting work as your own. It is a way of protecting the project, such that the kind of the nightmare scenario is a contributor comes along, contributes something to a project, that gets sedimented into the project, and then that contributor either one, asserts their patent right against that and starts suing everybody, or two, that contributor didn't actually own what they contributed, and the actual owner litigates against the open source project. Those are kind of the nightmare scenarios. CLAs don't actually totally protect against that, because CLAs just really give you someone else to sue. It gives you kind of a third party to go after. They don't really protect against it. It's kind of it's an unlikely scenario to begin with. We don't believe in them because they act as an impediment to open source contribution. So we don't have them on our projects, but you may be in a project that does require a CLA, needs to sign a CLA. We will do that relatively quickly. We don't want to spend a lot of time redlining a CLA. You should come to the OSCO and just get that done. Because you do need someone from the company to be like, yes, fine. But that can be done relatively quickly. V8 in particular, Google projects have historically required a CLA, so that's where you're going to find. All right, I'm going to try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. So I promised a hard stop at 11. On open source creation, so we also we create a lot of open source things, and our overwhelming bias is that the things we create will be open source. That said, even where we create a new proprietary repository, it should be done with the idea that it will be open sourced at some point. That doesn't mean it's got a license on it necessarily, but it means that it's got copyright everywhere for sure, and it means that some of these other things apply to it. The repository should be on GitHub. So sorry, Bitbucket. Repository should be on GitHub. It should be always under the Joyent account. Again, we haven't always been great about this ourselves. Not under a personal account. It should be under the Joyent GitHub account, whether that's open or for the moment proprietary. Where it's open, the license should be the MPL2. The part of the reason for the MPL2 is it contains a warrant around originality. So the MPL2 actually allows you to gives you another reason to not have a CLA. There are exceptions to this. There are exceptions where we are creating things that are in a larger ecosystem that have a prevailing license. I mean, NPM modules tend to be MIT licensed. If you're developing a Linux driver, that's going to be GPL'd. So there are going to be situations where you need to have a different license. Those should be done with the explicit permission of the OSCO. So we just want to make sure that if it's on MPL2, that we're doing it with the OSCOs given the thumbs up on that. In terms of, this is really important, and just something we have to always be vigilant about, because everything either is open or will be open, we need to be really, really careful about what we commit to a repository. Do not commit key material or passwords to a repository. Sounds obvious, it can be hard. And it can be hard, especially where this has bit us in the past, is when, in particular, around test data. Like, I want some test data to grind on this thing. Oh, I'll grab some data from production. That'll be like some really good test data. And that probably is good test data. And then well, a bunch of this test data, lives in Manta and it's private. So maybe I'll sign a URL and I'll put the signed URL in the repo. It's like, well, now that data is as good as public, and we need to rekey things. And it's easy to see how you end up there. It's like, I don't think you're going to take your SSH key and commit it. I don't think you're going to, I don't think anyone's going to do a git add of authorized keys. That feels unlikely. But there are other ways that we end up in this situation. There's not a mechanical guideline here. This is just something we've got to be careful about. Especially, just be careful if you are ever pulling anything from production for any reason and having that go into a repo. Just make sure that you're eyeballing all the things that you're doing. I would tell you to catch it in code review, but code review is too late for this stuff because code review is also public. So this is something that you cannot rely on code review to catch. Everyone's just got to be careful. So not a simple one on that one, unfortunately.
Got to be careful with domain names too.
Got to be careful with domain names. Yeah. In terms of
I think a lot of the Samsung like the SCloud.host stuff isn't public, right? That's right.
Domain names, does a UUID of a machine that's in test data, does that constitute, is that a secret or not? Well, maybe. I think that's one of those things where we want to just be careful, get the, as Trent points out, the SAPI service JSON includes keys. Is that a good, can we improve things to minimize risk there? Yes, but in the meantime, something to be really cognizant of. So just please be careful, and just be careful about what you're putting in those repos and divulging. On CLAs, we already talked about CLAs. Again, we're not going to put CLA in our stuff, so there will be no CLA on the stuff we create, and we kind of famously removed the CLA from that. Not that it bought us anything with the community, of course. And then finally, on our own codes of conduct, in the last 12 seconds, We have not generally had codes of conduct in our repositories. That is not because of a point of principle. That's just because the repositories themselves have predated. The codes of conduct have become much more broadly proliferated in the last 2 years, which is great. I think it's a good change. I think that the contributor covenant, which I should put a link to in the RFD, is a very good template because it is you can't, and the contributor covenant makes this clear. You cannot prescribe decency. If you try to say these are all the rules of decency, indecent people will find ways to work around the rules. And that's not the point. The point is not to have an exhaustive list of rules that constitute acceptable behavior. The point is to have a principle around what constitutes acceptable behavior. And yes, relying on people to have their individual judgment. And then importantly, with the code of conduct, having an escalation path when someone believes that code of conduct has been violated. Certainly, I think the proliferation of codes of conduct is a great change. We probably need it in a bunch of places. Certainly, we need it in the Limos and SmartOS. So where you don't see it, it's not because we don't believe in it. And if we've got a repository that has, now that said, you've got a repository which only you are contributing to, a code of conduct may be putting things a bit ahead of things, that may be putting the cart ahead of the horse. I wouldn't just kind of knee-jerk a code of conduct in there, in part because I think sometimes people will knee-jerk a code of conduct in there and then kind of check the conduct box. It's not a box to check. We are always going to conduct ourselves in a way that is professional and decent and consistent with our own principles. So it's not something I would necessarily immediately put in every repo, but it's something that if we've got repositories that have a lot of attention on them, in that we're getting people outside the company engaged and so on, then the code of conduct certainly belongs there. I've got 2 minutes over with my apologies. I thought this was going to be quick, and here I was rushing at the end. Are there specific questions that I can deal with in the negative 2 minutes that I have? Just going back through chat. Angela, you were the one that prompted this. Thank you very much for that. Questions or things that?
No, I think you covered everything. Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, you bet. So, this RFD will obviously be a living document. If and as we hit other edge conditions, we'll get them in here. But I think just in general, I don't want to be too rules based about any of this. We want to be principles based. We are an open source company. We have a bias towards open source, to contributing the changes that we've made, contributing that upstream, and acting, building communities and acting decently within those communities. Those are our guiding principles. With that, thank you very much.
Thanks.